Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Pretty soon, or at least eventually, I plan on rank 5ing, awakening, and sigging up my Human Torch. But I'll be asking the same question many people have. Do I even need him awakened? And if I do need him awakened, what sig level is good enough? Does it matter? And unfortunately, this isn't like a simple sig level question like Void, where it's like, yeah, dude, you get more damage, or Omega Red, you get more damage, or Cap Infinity War, you want max sig for, the guaranteed debuff application, etc. Don't want to mess around with RNG. Human Torch just has a little bit more to him, and I'll give you, a quick run through of what his awakened ability is, as well as like the too long didn't watch, answer for what I believe the sweet spot for signature levels, and then I'll explain the math if you're interested in that afterwards. So as far as what his awakened ability is, at the start of the fight, if Human Torch has 0 persistent charges, i.e. if you've used his pre-fight ability, and his pre-fight ability is not active, he has a 10.05 to 20% chance to gain 1 persistent charge that he uses to activate his pre-fight ability. Additionally, this chance increases by a flat 12.06% to 40% every time the ability fails to activate. And for every sig level, the two percentages increase over time. So when I was trying to look at the numbers here, I just kind of hovered over it and I relied on AntMy to get my numbers. And I'll show you my Excel sheet real quick. So this is a lot. Don't worry. If you're, not interested in how the math breaks down, let me tell you, you get most of the value at sig level 1, just with like any other champion who has this kind of an unlock, because what it does is it allows you to have access to his pre-fight ability more than once in a single quest, most often used in things like Abyss of Legends, where you're going to be popping a lot of revives anyways. But as you can see here, the number of fights it would take for you to get your pre-fight back, it goes down every 20 at a pretty consistent scale, and then teeters off here around the 80 to 120 region. So for this reason, I personally think the sweet spot, hey, I got the most value out of it as I could, is somewhere in the 60 to 80 signature level. I think anywhere from 20 to 40 is probably fine if you're, trying to jump science 6 stones into someone else, but at least 60 to 80 if you're running on a plethora of 6 science 6 stones. That said, you do see gains all the way up to 200, and there's a relatively convincing reason to sig 200 this guy if you're using him quite frequently. That said, I'll jump into the math. So the math here is a little complicated. So what I have here is the start. So at each signature level, this is just the base amount what you would have on the fight after you've used your pre-fight. So the first fight after, you have a base 10.05, and then luckily Kabam has done very well scaling it, where at every 20 interval here, it's 11, 12, 13, 14, etc. % on start, where at sig 200 you have a 20% chance to get it on that very first fight. On the second fight, it goes up by a set amount, and that set amount increases each time. So all I've done here is I've taken that set amount, and for each sig level, I've scaled it up to go through all the number of fights until it would eventually hit 100% or guaranteed. So you can see here on sig level 1, on your 9th fight, if you haven't gotten your persistent charge back yet, you are guaranteed to get it there. At sig level 20, it's at fight 8. At sig level 40, it's at fight 7, etc., etc., all the way to sig 80, where it stops. And it doesn't become guaranteed until lower than fight 5 until you hit sig 140. Same thing here, it doesn't become guaranteed lower than fight 4 until sig level 200, where it becomes guaranteed at fight 3. Now, if you look at it just like this is where you draw the 80 to 100, because you can make the assumption or the logical conclusion, at worst, at each sig level here, this is the number of fights it would take you to get your pre-fight ability back. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, etc. That would be if RNG completely screwed you, you're just running with the worst of luck, that's how many it would take. And then here is a rough estimated average, or median, sorry, not average, of number of fights. This number is better than the average because the average is kind of tricky to calculate here on a compounding probability. But what's more important is to look at probability you will not get the charge back after, and the number of fights. And the reason this is different than just the scaling probability of your chance to get it is, in order to get your pre-fight ability back on the second fight, you would have already had to have not gotten it back on the first fight. So this is essentially probability of A if B has already occurred. And that scales all the way down. And the way you do it is essentially you just take your first fight, the probability of not getting your charge back after is essentially 100% minus your probability of getting that first charge on the first fight. So in this case, it's 89.95. On the second fight, it would be the probability of not getting it on the second fight multiplied by the probability that you wouldn't have gotten it on the first fight. Because again, in order to get the charge on the second fight or not get it on the second fight, you would have already had to have not gotten it on your first fight, and see that compounding scale. So this is actually like a really clever and interesting way Kabam has introduced Human Torch's ability. I wish the math was a little more straightforward, because I feel like it's something that will go over a lot of people's heads as they kind of try to figure out where the ideal location is. But hopefully, this is good enough. What I've done here is I've changed it from probably you will not, because that's just easier to calculate, to probability you will get. And this is where it becomes really important to kind of address why I said, even 20 to 40 sig is pretty reasonable. And the reason for that is if we're not looking at the number of fights at worst or the number of fights at best, etc. What we want to look at is where is the coin toss, right? At what point, at what number of fights am I taking the 50-50? So at 3 fights on SIG level 1, you're at about 50-50. So if you haven't gotten your charge back after 3 fights, then you've lost the coin toss. If you haven't gotten it back after 4 fights, you've lost essentially 3 out of 4 coin tosses. And by 5 fights, you're almost at 90%. And this is where you can start feeling like even at SIG 1, you're starting to get burned, because fights 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all generally close to 100%. So even SIG 1 is really, really good to have, and this is where why I can draw the conclusion you get most of your value at SIG 1. As we see down here, at SIG 20, the breakpoint for the coin toss is still 3 fights. It's actually closer to like 2.8 fights, give or take, depending on how you push the average. For SIG level 40 here, it's closer to like 2.2 fights, etc. And you see here, all the way here at SIG 120, the coin toss is actually after 2 fights. So it takes the first 120 SIG levels to go from a coin toss up to 3 fights, down to coin toss at 2 fights. That's kind of how the math breaks down, and it's really, really cool to see. So that said, hopefully this helps. Feel free to check my math. I always appreciate it. I'll have a link for a view of the Excel sheet in the description below. Maybe, I calculated something wrong, or hey, I'm not addressing the probability correctly here, and again, if it's too long, it's too complicated, you didn't watch, SIG 1 is technically all you need. If you have some extra SIG stones, try to push up to 80. Good enough. Talk to y'all later. Peace.